You think 6 years of mortgage checks buy you a say in this family, old man? Lauren's voice was flat and precise, each word placed like a knife on a cutting board. Her leather glove pressed flat against my chest, pinning me against my own kitchen counter. Behind her, the radiator kept clanking in the silence, the only sound in a room where no one else dared to breathe. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. She looked at me the way people look at furniture they've already decided to throw to the curb. Before I tell you how I ended up cornered in my own kitchen by the woman my son married, let me know where you're watching from tonight in the comments below. If you believe the truth always finds a way to the surface, hit like and subscribe. Was I really losing my mind, the way she needed everyone to believe? Was the money my son swore he sent me every single month ever real at all, and whose hand had actually been signing away pieces of my life for 6 long years without me ever knowing it? To understand how a retired auditor with 40 years of experience hunting thieves ended up trapped against his own kitchen counter, you have to go back to a single knock on a door. Not the door of my apartment. A different door, in a different city, a door that should have opened onto my son's first house. A door where, instead of my son's face, a complete stranger looked out at me and asked a question that split my entire world in two. Who are you? But before that door, you need to know who I am and what I gave up to get there. My name is Oscar Blake. I am 72 years old, a retired corporate auditor who spent 4 decades chasing missing money through the ledgers of men who thought they were smarter than the paper trail they left behind. When my wife Diane died 10 years ago, the medical bills swallowed everything we had. I sold our house. For 6 years after that, working freelance forensic jobs at night, I quietly covered the mortgage on the first house my son Jared ever bought. Back before his software company took off, back when he was drowning in debt and too proud to ask his old man for help out loud. I never told him it was me. I just paid it, month after month, and let him believe he'd done it alone. That was the kind of father I tried to be. Invisible, reliable, silent. Jared became a millionaire before he turned 35, a software CEO with his name in business magazines. I ended up in a drafty, crumbling apartment on a forgotten block of Chicago, wearing 2 sweaters indoors just to keep my hands from shaking, walking 6 blocks twice a week to the church food pantry for canned soup and powdered milk. Jared believed he had it handled. He told me, every time we spoke, that he'd set up a family trust, $8,000 a month, managed by his wife Lauren, to make sure I never wanted for anything. I never saw a single dollar of it. I was too proud to ask why. I didn't know it yet, but an auditor's mind never actually retires, and mine was about to be handed the most devastating case of my career, hidden inside my own family. It was Father's Day. A gray, heavy Chicago afternoon, the wind slapping against my thin window glass. I was alone at my small kitchen table, eating lukewarm soup from a dented pot, when a hard, urgent knock rattled my door. Jared usually sent a text on days like this. Maybe had his assistant mail a card. He never just showed up. I pushed myself up, my knees cracking in protest, and opened the door to find my son standing there in a cashmere coat that cost more than my monthly grocery budget for a year, his expensive watch catching the dim hallway light. His confident smile died the second his eyes adjusted to my apartment. He stepped inside. I watched his gaze crawl over the water stains on my ceiling, the single space heater plugged into an overloaded outlet, the bowl of watery soup sitting on my bare table. His face went the color of ash. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking as he pulled off his gloves. "What is this place? What are you doing here?" "This is my home, Jared," I told him calmly. "I've lived here 3 years." He ran a hand through his hair, spinning in place like the walls themselves had betrayed him. "The condo," he stammered. "Lauren said she moved you into that senior community downtown. She sends me photos, the pool, the dining hall, the medical staff. She said you loved it there." "What condo?" I asked. "I have never once set foot in a luxury condo in my life, son." The color drained fully out of his face. He pulled out his phone, scrolling frantically. "Dad, Lauren manages the family trust. I told her to make sure you never wanted for anything." He looked up at me, eyes wide with a fear I hadn't seen on his face since he was a boy. "Dad, are you happy with the $8,000 Lauren sends you every month?" The number hung in the freezing air between us like something with physical weight. 8,000 a month, 96,000 a year, enough to change every single thing about how I was living. I hesitated. I did not want to be the reason a marriage cracked open. But I was done carrying the weight of a lie that wasn't mine to protect. Son, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper, no one is sending me any money. The church food pantry is what's keeping me alive these days. Jared staggered back like I'd struck him. And that was the exact moment the door swung open again, and Lauren walked in. The contrast between her and my apartment was almost violent. She was 36, wrapped in a white designer wool coat that cost more than my annual rent, a leather handbag on her arm, a wave of expensive perfume rolling ahead of her like a warning flare. She froze the instant she saw Jared standing in the middle of the room. For one flickering half-second, I saw pure panic behind her eyes. She knew. She knew exactly what had just come apart. Then, just as fast, the panic vanished, replaced by something rehearsed. "Jared, honey," she cried, dropping her bag on a chair and rushing to grip his arm. "I didn't want you to see him like this. I've been trying so hard to protect you." "Protect me from what, Lauren?" Jared demanded, yanking his arm free. "He just told me he's living off a church food pantry. Where is the $8,000? Where is the condo you showed me pictures of?" She let out a trembling sob, pressing manicured fingers to her lips, and turned to look at me with wide, condescending pity. "Oh, Oscar," she said, "your poor, broken mind. Jared, I've been depositing that money every single month, I swear it. But his dementia, it's gotten so much worse. The specialist warned me this would happen. He hides the money. He forgets where he puts it. He wandered off from the condo 3 months ago and rented this place in a state of confusion. I've been trying every single day to bring him home, but he gets aggressive. He thinks everyone is stealing from him." I stood frozen by my own counter, stunned by the sheer speed and polish of the lie. I had never set foot inside a luxury condo in my life. My mind had never been sharper. But she spun her story with such conviction, such wet-eyed sincerity, that I watched my own son's face shift from fury to a kind of devastated, tender concern. He was no longer looking at his father. He was looking at a patient. Suddenly his phone buzzed. "The board," he muttered, thick with exhaustion. "Give me 5 minutes in the hallway. Please, just stay here." The door clicked shut behind him, and the moment it did, the temperature of the room changed. Lauren's tears cut off instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. Her spine straightened. The performance was gone, and what remained underneath it looked at me the way a predator looks at something already caught. She crossed the kitchen in 3 sharp clicks of her heels and backed me against the counter, her glove flat against my chest, her face inches from mine. "You think 6 years of mortgage checks buy you a say in this family, old man?" she hissed. "When Jared walks back through that door, you're going to look confused. You're going to mumble. If you breathe one word about the money, I will destroy you. I have medical power of attorney paperwork already drafted. I have doctors on my payroll who will sign whatever I tell them to sign. Cross me, and I will have you declared incompetent by Tuesday morning. You'll rot in the worst psychiatric ward in this city until you forget your own name." For one honest second, something in me did shake. Not the performance I was about to give her, but something real, a genuine tremor that started in my hands and ran up into my chest. The old animal fear of a man realizing exactly how much power someone else holds over the rest of his life. I let her see it. I let her think it was surrender. Because I knew the golden rule I'd learned in 40 years of dismantling men just like her. You never make a sound until you have every piece of evidence you need to burn the whole structure down. I let my shoulders slump. I let my jaw go slack. The sharp gaze of the auditor faded into the vacant stare she was expecting, and I stared down at my cracked linoleum floor and gave her nothing at all. She scoffed quietly, victorious, certain she had broken a man in under a minute. She had no idea she was looking at the last 4 decades of her life about to be audited by the person she'd just underestimated worst. When Jared stepped back inside, rubbing his eyes, exhausted, Lauren slid instantly back into her role, soft hands rubbing his back, the picture of a loving, long-suffering wife. I shuffled my feet. I let my voice go fragile and asked him, in a small, raspy whisper, if it was time for dinner yet. I asked if his mother was coming home soon. Hearing me ask for Diane, gone 10 years, broke something open in his face. He rushed over, held my shoulders, told me gently that Mom wasn't coming back, that everything was going to be all right. Lauren stood behind him, rubbing his back, offering quiet comfort, and over his shoulder she gave me a smirk so small only I could see it. They stayed 20 more minutes, speaking to me like a fragile glass doll who might shatter at any moment. Jared promised the best doctors in the city. He promised he'd come back tomorrow with a care team. I nodded along to every single word, my eyes dead and vacant, agreeing to nothing while appearing to agree to everything. The moment the door clicked shut behind them and their footsteps faded down the hallway, the fog lifted off my face like smoke clearing from a room. My spine straightened. The tremor in my hands stopped completely, replaced by something colder and infinitely more useful. Lauren believed she had just neutralized a helpless old man. She had no idea she had just declared war on the one man in this family who had spent his entire career finding exactly where the money went. I sat down at my kitchen table and pushed the cold soup aside. $96,000 a year was vanishing somewhere. A woman wearing a coat worth more than my car was orchestrating it. My son was completely blind to what was happening 2 feet in front of him. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to cry. I needed a paper trail, and I had spent 40 years learning exactly how to build one out of nothing. I thought about Diane, about the 6 years I'd spent secretly wiring money to cover Jared's very first mortgage before his company ever made a dime, working double shifts of freelance forensic auditing after losing her, never once telling him how hard it was, never once letting him see me sweat. I had built that boy an entire life out of silence and sacrifice, and somewhere along the way, someone had learned to profit from that same silence, using my own son's guilt as a weapon and my own invisibility as a shield. I pulled a blank notepad and a blue pen from the kitchen drawer. I wrote down the name of my bank. I wrote down $8,000, the number Jared believed he was sending every month. I began, right there at my chipped laminate table, to map the first steps of a forensic audit the way I'd done 1,000 times before, for firms who paid me handsomely to find exactly this kind of rot. Except this time, there was no fee waiting for me at the end. There was only the truth, and the 6 years of my own quiet sacrifice, and a debt that someone was about to learn I intended to collect in full. Tomorrow, the confused old man with the failing mind was going to take a slow, deliberate walk to his bank. The investigation had already begun, and Lauren didn't even know it yet. The next morning came in bitter and gray, the cold pressing straight through my apartment's thin walls before the sun had fully cleared the lake. I was awake before it, dressed not in the faded sweaters I wore to the pantry, but in the heavy wool overcoat I'd kept clean in a garment bag for exactly an occasion like this one. I walked 4 blocks to the retail bank on the corner, the warm marble lobby wrapping around me like a memory of a life I used to have, and asked for Beverly, the branch manager who'd known me 3 years and never once treated me like a man whose mind was slipping. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I told her I needed a full forensic review of my incoming trust deposits, that I suspected a serious irregularity. Her smile faded into focus. She pulled up 12 months of transaction history, and there, on the first of every month without fail, sat an $8,000 wire from Jared's corporate trust. My son had told me the truth. Relief cracked something open in my chest. Then Beverly frowned at her screen. "Mr. Blake," she said slowly, "your incoming deposits are consistent, but your available balance doesn't reflect any of it. Your balance is practically nothing." She pulled the outgoing ledger. Less than 30 seconds after each $8,000 deposit cleared, an automated sweep fired, pulling $7,800 out to an account on the East Coast, leaving exactly $200 behind every single time. Just enough that the account never triggered a dormant balance warning. Just enough to keep me alive and quiet and fed on canned soup, while the rest disappeared. I asked her to trace the destination. The receiving account belonged to a limited liability company. Beverly read the name off the screen. L Prime Holdings. I stared at that letter L for a long moment. Lauren hadn't even bothered to hide behind a stranger's name. She'd named her theft after herself because in her mind no one watching her was capable of reading a ledger. I asked Beverly to leave the sweep running. If we froze it now, Lauren would know she'd been caught, and she'd bury the evidence before I ever got the chance to hand it to my son. I copied the routing number, the account number, the exact dates into my notepad, thanked her for her discretion, and walked back out into the cold with something I hadn't carried in 10 years. Purpose. By that afternoon, I was at a public terminal in the Chicago Library, tracing L Prime Holdings through the Florida Business Registry, then through county property records until a beachfront estate outside Miami filled my screen. White walls, a private pool, a dock stretching into blue water. The mortgage, taxes, and association fees on that house added up, almost to the dollar, to $7,800 a month. Every cent stolen from my survival fund was paying for someone's tropical paradise. I searched Lauren's parents' names on social media next, and found Anthony and Barbara sitting on a sun-drenched balcony that matched the estate's railing exactly, champagne in hand, a caption thanking their wonderful daughter for helping them find their dream forever home. Self-made, the caption said. Blessed. I sat in that quiet library and felt something colder than the Chicago wind settle into my chest. They weren't self-made. They were living like royalty on the exact money that was supposed to keep their daughter's father-in-law from freezing to death. I wrote the Miami address into my notepad beneath the routing numbers, closed the browser, and walked back out into the wind with my knees aching and my spine straighter than it had been in a decade. I knew Lauren would eventually notice I wasn't sitting quietly in my apartment where she'd left me. I knew she would come looking, and when she did, I intended for her to find exactly the wrong old man waiting for her. For 3 days, I played my part with more discipline than I had ever brought to any professional engagement in my career. I wore the faded sweaters. I shuffled to the pantry on schedule. I let my shoulders slump every time I stepped outside my door. But I could feel Lauren's attention on me even when I couldn't see her, the way you feel a storm pressure building before the sky actually breaks. The landline in my apartment rang at strange hours, always silent when I picked up. Always exactly the kind of check-in a woman makes when she's testing whether her captive is still sitting in his cage. I didn't know it yet, but the address I decided to visit on the 4th morning would hand me the second half of a case I thought I already understood completely. It was the house. Jared's first house, the one I had quietly paid the mortgage on for 6 years before his company ever turned a profit, back when he was a kid, drowning in startup, debt too proud to call his father for help. I hadn't laid eyes on it since the year he sold it and moved into the glass tower downtown with Lauren. I told myself I was only going out of sentiment, an old man wanting to see the porch where his son used to sit up late coding on a laptop balanced on his knees. But an auditor doesn't really believe in sentiment as a motive. Some instinct in me wanted to see who was living in the last thing I had ever secretly built for my son with my own 2 hands. I took 2 buses to get there, the neighborhood greener and quieter than mine, small brick houses with actual working furnaces behind actual unbroken windows. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment looking at the porch, the same navy shutters, a child's bicycle now, leaning against the railing that used to hold nothing but Jared's coffee mugs. I walked up and knocked, not entirely sure what I expected to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe just an old man's ghost story about a house he used to visit. The door opened, and a stranger stood in the frame. A woman in her 40s, a dish towel over one shoulder, a look of polite confusion already forming on her face before I'd said a word. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm sorry to bother you," I said. "My son used to own this house. I was just passing by." She studied me a moment, and something in her expression shifted from confusion to a kind of cautious pity, the look people give an old man they suspect might be lost. "Who are you?" she asked, not unkindly, just carefully, the way you'd speak to someone you weren't sure could find his way home. The question landed harder than she meant it to. Who are you? I had spent 6 years paying for the roof over that door without ever once putting my name on the deed, and here I was standing on the porch of my own sacrifice, and a stranger was asking me to prove I belonged there at all. I told her my name, told her I meant no trouble, and she softened, invited me to stand out of the wind for a moment while she explained. She and her husband had been renting the house for 2 years now, she said, through a management company. The landlord, she told me, was a lawyer, A man named Arthur Pierce. I stood very still on that porch. Arthur Pierce. The same thin man in the gray suit who had shown up at my apartment with a briefcase full of paperwork designed to steal my voice. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, whether Mr. Pierce personally handled many properties like this one. She shrugged and said she thought he managed several rentals around the city, all bought and sold pretty quietly, usually through elderly sellers she'd heard, people downsizing or moving into care facilities. She said it like harmless trivia. To me, it landed like a second ledger cracking open beneath the first one. I thanked her, apologized again for the intrusion, and walked back to the bus stop with my mind already racing 3 steps ahead of my feet. Lauren wasn't operating alone. She had a professional beside her, a man whose fingerprints touched more properties than one greedy daughter-in-law could possibly need for a single scheme. Was Pierce simply her lawyer, or was Lauren just one piece on a board that a much older, much more practiced predator had been playing for years? 3 existing questions I'd carried out of that library now multiplied into a fourth. "Who are you?" the stranger had asked me. I was starting to wonder whether the better question was, who is Arthur Pierce, and how many other families had already lost someone the way I was about to lose everything. I went back to the library that same afternoon, my knees screaming from the walking, and searched Arthur Pierce's name through the state bar registry and the county property records. It didn't take an auditor's training to see the pattern once you knew where to look, though it certainly helped. Pierce's name appeared as legal counsel on no fewer than 6 emergency medical power of attorney filings over the past 4 years, always attached to elderly clients, always finalized within days of being drafted, always followed within months by a quiet property transfer to an LLC that shared an address with his law office. Some of those LLCs I recognized instantly. L Prime Holdings sat right there in the list beside 3 others with different names, but the same registered agent, the same Florida filing clerk, the same sloppy paper trail left by people who believed no one poor enough to need a food pantry would ever think to check. Lauren wasn't the architect of this. Lauren was a client. A greedy, willing, comfortable client, but a client all the same, being run by a man who had turned elder exploitation into a quiet, repeatable business model, and who had likely taught her exactly how to hollow out a trust fund without triggering a single alarm. I sat at that library terminal with my hands folded, feeling something shift inside my chest, a recalibration of the entire shape of the war I thought I was fighting. This was no longer one greedy woman I needed to expose. This was a structure, and structures don't fall from a single blow. They fall from the bottom up, all at once. When every load-bearing wall gives way in the same moment, I copied every filing date, every LLC name, every property address into my notepad, the pages filling faster now, the blue ink pressed hard enough to nearly tear through in places. When I finally closed the browser and stood, my body ached in every joint I owned. But for the first time in 10 years, I didn't feel like a man running out of road. I felt like a man who had just found the exact size and shape of the wall he needed to bring down. That evening, back in my apartment, I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. I pulled a battered cardboard box out from under my bed, the one holding what little I'd kept of Diane after the house sold. Old photographs. A few pieces of her jewelry I could never bring myself to pawn, even in the leanest months, and a stack of her handwritten letters and journal pages from the last years of her life. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I think some part of me simply needed to sit near her for a moment before I walked back into a war. Near the bottom of the box, tucked inside an old recipe tin, I found a letter I didn't remember her writing, folded small, the paper gone soft and yellow at the creases. It was dated less than a year before she died. I sat down hard on the edge of my bed and read it by the weak light of my single lamp, and my hands were not steady this time. Not for any performance, not for anyone watching. She had written about Jared, about how proud she was of him, about how quickly he was learning to build things with his mind that neither of us had ever understood. And then, in her plain, careful handwriting, she had written a single worried line that I read 3 times before I could fully take it in. She hoped that as he grew successful, he would remember that money makes people easy to fool. especially the people who love you most, and that she prayed he would surround himself with people who loved him enough to tell him the truth, even when it cost them something. It wasn't a prophecy. It wasn't a warning about a woman named Lauren or a lawyer named Pierce, because Diane had never met either of them and could not have known what was coming. It was simply a mother's plain, aching hope, written a decade too early to save anyone, and it broke something open in my chest that had stayed sealed since her funeral. I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time, the letter resting in my lap, listening to the radiator hiss and clank against the cold, and for the first time since Father's Day I let myself cry, not performing weakness for anyone, just an old man alone in a freezing apartment missing his wife, and furious that the family they'd built together had been quietly bled dry by people who never deserved a single dollar of what she and I had sacrificed to build it. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my coat pocket, where the notepad already sat, and I decided right then that whatever came next, I would carry her words into that room with me the same way I carried the routing numbers. The next few days moved fast, faster than I expected. I noticed the same dark sedan twice near the church pantry, once idling across the street while I stood in line for canned soup, and once again 3 blocks from the library. I noticed a man in a heavy coat reading the same newspaper on the same bench outside my bank branch, 2 days running, never quite turning a page. 40 years of watching people try not to be watched had left me with a good instinct for it, and I did not change my routine even a little. I wanted whoever was following me to see exactly where I went. Panic makes people sloppy, and I needed Lauren sloppy. It worked faster than I expected. Within 3 days, a private investigator's dossier landed on her kitchen table, filled with photographs that told her everything she was terrified to learn. Me walking into the bank. Me sitting for nearly an hour in Beverly's glass office. Me hunched over a public terminal for hours at the library, clearly not reading newspapers or magazines. I imagine the moment she opened that folder and the pieces clicked into place, the specialist dementia diagnosis she'd invented dissolving in her hands, replaced by the much more dangerous truth that the quiet old man she'd been starving for 3 years had spent his entire career doing exactly what he was doing to her now. A predator who realizes she has become the hunted does not apologize. She accelerates. I understood that as clearly as I understood my own name, and I spent those final quiet evenings before her next move memorizing every figure in my notepad, rehearsing every explanation I would need to give calmly, and without a single tremor in my voice, because I knew that whatever came through my door next would be an attempt to silence me for good before I ever reached my son. I did not have to wait long to find out I was right. The knock came on a Thursday afternoon, 4 sharp strikes against the peeling wood, and when I opened it, Lauren stood in the hallway in a tailored black coat and leather gloves, her face wiped completely clean of the fake tenderness she wore for Jared. Beside her stood a tall, thin man with slicked-back graying hair, a gray suit that tried too hard to look expensive, and a heavy leather briefcase gripped in one hand. I recognized him instantly, not from that Father's Day, because he hadn't come that day, but from a photograph I had printed at the library 2 days earlier and folded into the same coat pocket as Diane's letter. Arthur Pierce. Lauren didn't ask permission. She pushed past me into my apartment as if she already owned it, Pierce trailing behind her, his nose wrinkling at the water stains on my ceiling, and the rust creeping across my radiator. I closed the door slowly, eyes cast down, my body already folding back into the shape of a frightened old man, while underneath that performance every instinct I had was standing at full attention, because I understood exactly what kind of paperwork was sitting inside that briefcase, and I understood that the next 20 minutes were going to decide whether I walked into my son's world as a father with proof or as a patient with no voice left at all. Lauren didn't bother removing her gloves. She pulled her phone from her coat, tapped the screen, and set it on my table on speaker. It rang twice before Jared picked up, his voice tired, distracted. Corporate stress bleeding through even over the line. "Jared, honey," Lauren said, her whole posture softening instantly. "I'm at your father's. Things have gotten so much worse today." He barely recognized me. "Dad." Jared's voice cracked through the speaker. "Are you there?" "I'm here, son," I said, letting my voice thin out into something fragile. Please just cooperate with Mr. Pierce, Jared said. I love you. I just want you safe. I love you too. I answered, and meant every word of it, even as the woman standing over me finished the call and slid her phone back into her coat, the warmth draining out of her face the instant the line went dead. Pierce set his briefcase on my table, unlatched it, and laid out a thick stack of paper beside a black pen. Sign it, Lauren said. What happens if I don't? I asked. I call the city tonight, she said. I tell them you're violent. You go to a state ward. Sedated. Forgotten. Pierce nodded once. No standing to fight it, he said. No resources. Sign it and you keep your bed tonight. I picked up the pen. My hand shook, and this time it wasn't only performance. I asked to read it first. Lauren rolled her eyes and paced. Pierce checked his watch. I read slowly, page by page, until halfway down the third page, a single boilerplate clause stopped my heart cold. Before any transfer of fiduciary authority could take effect, it required an automatic forensic audit of every associated family trust by the primary accounting firm on file. Pierce had copied it straight from a corporate template without reading what it actually did. Jared's trust ran through the same ruthless firm that audited his entire software empire. They weren't binding my hands. They were arming a detonator and handing it to me to sign myself. You promise I stay here? I asked, playing the part all the way to the floor. I promise, Oscar, Lauren said, smiling like a knife. I signed. Pierce stamped it twice, snapped his briefcase shut, and Lauren leaned down close enough that I could smell her perfume one last time. You're pathetic, she said. Don't ever leave this apartment again. The door shut. The latch clicked. I listened until the building went silent, and then I stood, walked to the sink, and washed the tremor off my hands for the last time I would ever need to fake it. By Tuesday morning, exactly as I knew it would, a courier walked that notarized document into Jared's corporate legal department, and a receptionist filed it under my name without a second thought. Somewhere inside that automated system, a young forensic accountant opened a routine file, expecting nothing more than an old man's grocery receipts, and instead found $8,000 arriving like clockwork and $7,800 vanishing 48 hours later into an account named after the very woman who'd just filed for legal control of my body. He would have stopped drinking his coffee. He would have pulled the property records. He would have found Miami and a beachfront estate, and a name that didn't belong on either. I sat in my kitchen and let myself feel, for 1 honest hour, the quiet satisfaction of a trap closing on its own, built entirely from Lauren's own arrogance. But I knew a corporate audit alone wouldn't be enough. A quiet internal report could still be buried, delayed, explained away by expensive lawyers, before I ever reached Jared with my own voice intact. I needed a witness inside the walls, someone with real authority who could not be paid off or talked out of what the numbers already proved. I thought of Wallace. I'd met Jared's chief financial officer years ago, briefly, at the party when the company first went public, a rigid, humorless man who talked about balance sheets, the way some men talk about scripture. I found his direct line through an old filing at the library and called him from my cheap mobile phone on a gray Wednesday morning. He answered, clipped and impatient, already prepared to dismiss me as a confused old man repeating his daughter-in-law's diagnosis. I gave him the routing number. I gave him the name L Prime Holdings. I gave him the Miami address and told him to check it against Lauren's maiden name. The line went quiet except for the fast click of his keyboard, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of impatience. He asked why I hadn't gone to the police. I told him the police would take years, and Lauren had the money to make years feel like forever. I told him I needed to hand my son proof in a room where she couldn't spin it into another lie, in front of enough witnesses that burying it would be impossible. Wallace was quiet for a long moment, and then he told me something that widened the whole shape of the case again. He'd flagged Arthur Pierce's name twice before. On 2 separate elder trust filings, the firm had quietly declined to handle after their own compliance team raised concerns. Pierce had a pattern. Lauren wasn't his only client. Nobody steals from this company and gets away with it, Wallace said. He told me he'd get me inside the building on Saturday night, through the service entrance, with his own security credentials 30 minutes before Jared's keynote. He promised to bring the printed audit himself. I hung up the phone and sat with that new information a long moment. Jared's company was about to go public, a milestone 2 decades in the making, and Lauren had turned the celebration into a lavish charity gala at the city's grandest ballroom, inviting investors, politicians, press, anyone whose admiration she could collect like trophies. I learned from Wallace, almost as an afterthought, that Jared had quietly arranged something else for that same evening, something he hadn't told Lauren the full details of. A short ceremony honoring his mother. A scholarship fund in Diane's name for first-generation college students. The kind of help she and I had once scraped together penny by penny for him alone. He wanted, Wallace said, to announce it himself, unprompted, as a surprise tribute during his keynote. I sat with that for a long time after Wallace and I ended the call. My son, without knowing a single thing about the war being fought 2 feet from him, had built the exact stage I needed. A room full of witnesses, a ceremony built around his mother's memory, a woman who had learned, at some point in her theft, to insult that very memory to my face, would now stand beneath a banner bearing Diane's name while the truth came down on her, like the roof of a house, with no more mortgage payments left to save it. I knelt on my bedroom floor that night and pried up the loose board beneath my bed, the one hiding the small metal box I'd kept for a true emergency. $1,200 saved penny by penny over 3 years of smaller portions and darker evenings. I didn't need groceries anymore. I needed our armor. I took the whole stack of bills to a tailor's shop on a quiet side street the next morning, the kind of place that had dressed successful men for decades, and I told the salesman, before he could finish deciding I didn't belong there, that I needed a dark charcoal suit finished by Saturday, and that price wasn't a concern. Standing in front of that 3-way mirror, while the tailor pinned fabric to my shoulders, I watched 3 years of deliberate slouching fall away from my own reflection. The lines on my face stopped looking like decay and started looking, for the first time since Diane died, like proof of survival. Lauren hadn't only stolen my money. She had tried to convince me I was already gone. I wasn't going to let her walk into that ballroom believing it one more day. I spent the 2 days before the gala rehearsing everything in my head, the routing numbers, the property addresses, the exact order I would lay it all in front of my son, and I carried 2 things in my coat pocket at all times. The folded letter Diane had written a decade before any of this began, and the blue notepad holding 6 years of proof that silence, however well-intentioned, always leaves a debt somebody eventually has to pay. I also carried, folded smaller than either of those, one honest admission I hadn't said out loud to anyone, not even to Diane's memory, in the quiet of my own kitchen. Some of this was my own doing. I had let my son build an entire marriage on a foundation of my silence, because I was too proud to say I was struggling, too proud to ever ask why the money never came, too proud to call and simply say, "Son, I am cold and I am hungry and I need you." Pride had cost me nothing when I was younger and had money to spare. Pride in this apartment had nearly cost me everything. Saturday arrived pale and cold. I put on the finished suit piece by piece, deliberately, the way a man puts on armor he intends to use only once, but needs to be perfect. I combed my hair back, shaved close, and stood in front of my cracked bathroom mirror looking, for the first time in years, like the man who had once walked into corporate boardrooms and made powerful men sweat through their expensive shirts. By nightfall, I stood in the service alley behind the grand ballroom, the golden glow of chandeliers spilling faintly through high windows, the muffled rhythm of a string quartet drifting out into the freezing dark. A long line of black cars wrapped around the front entrance, delivering investors and politicians and reporters to celebrate my son's rise, and though none of them knew it yet, to witness the fall of the woman standing beside him. The service door clicked open exactly on schedule, and Wallace stepped out into the cold in a sharp black tuxedo, a thick manila folder already in his hand. He looked at me a long moment, taking in the suit, the folder in my own coat pocket, the stillness in my face, and something like respect passed between 2 men who had both spent their careers reading numbers. Other people tried to hide. "Nobody steals from this family and walks away clean," he said again. quieter this time, and held the door open into the warm gold light of the room where everything was about to change. The mahogany doors swung open just enough for me to slip through unnoticed, and the sensory wall of that room hit me at once. Thousands of crystal drops catching the light, waiters gliding past with champagne, the same sweet perfume Lauren always wore now multiplied 100 times over by every woman in the room trying to smell like money. I found her near the front, an emerald gown pooling around her heels, laughing with a cluster of investors, and as I moved closer along the wall, I caught 4 words meant only for the socialite beside her. That ridiculous dead wife's scholarship, Lauren murmured, rolling her eyes, already bored of pretending to care. Something in my chest went very still and very cold. I let it settle into resolve instead of rage, and I kept walking through the shadows at the edge of the room. The music dropped. A spotlight found the stage. Jared stepped up to the podium, and after his opening remarks about legacy and honesty, his voice softened into something private and unguarded. He told the room about his mother, about the house we sold, about the tuition I paid without ever once complaining, and he unveiled, with real tears in his eyes, a new scholarship fund carrying Diane's name for first-generation students who had nobody paying their way. Lauren pressed a hand to her heart and let a single manufactured tear slide down her cheek for the cameras. I stepped out of the shadows. I walked the center aisle slowly, and the room noticed me the way a held breath notices silence, conversation dying in a wave that rolled from the back doors to the stage. Jared's words caught in his throat. He gripped the podium edge, staring at a father he'd been told was locked away and failing, now standing in a tailored suit with a folder under his arm and nothing broken in his eyes at all. "Dad," he whispered into the microphone, and the whole room heard it. Lauren turned. The color left her face in one long drop, champagne spilling down the front of her gown as her hand began to shake. I climbed the stage steps. Security moved toward me, and Jared raised one hand, and they stopped. "I love you," I told him quietly, close enough to the microphone that every corner of that ballroom heard it. "And your empire is rotting from the inside." I held out the folder. "Read page 1. He opened it. 8,000 in. 7,800 out 48 hours later every month for 3 years. L Prime Holdings." His wife's name on the filing. "You stole from him," Jared said, and his voice was not loud, but it cut through that ballroom like a blade through silk. "You left my father to freeze while you built your parents a mansion. It was an investment strategy," Lauren said. "For our future." "Whose future?" I asked. "Not mine." I nearly starved inside it. At that exact moment, Wallace stepped up beside the stage with his phone raised. A State Bar investigator on the line, confirming that Arthur Pierce was already under formal review for 4 other elder conservatorship filings, 3 of them, it would turn out, involving trust accounts drained through nearly identical automated sweeps. Pierce, standing near the ballroom side exit, went pale as 2 uniformed officers who had been quietly waiting outside at Wallace's earlier request stepped through the door. "Enough," Jared said, not to me, to Lauren, cutting her off mid-sentence as she tried to spin one more lie about diversifying assets. "Enough." He turned to the stunned crowd. "This woman starved my father for 3 years and let me believe I was taking care of him." He said it plainly, without shame, in front of every investor and politician in that room, and something in me eased that I hadn't realized was still clenched tight after 3 years of silence. From somewhere near the back doors, a small voice cut through the murmuring crowd, clear and unguarded, the way only a child's voice can be. Why did the bad lady take Grandpa's soup money? A little girl, maybe 6, tugging her mother's sleeve. Having overheard enough of the commotion to ask the one question every adult in that ballroom was too polished to ask out loud. A ripple of something raw passed through the crowd, laughter and heartbreak tangled together, and I saw more than one investor wipe at their eyes. Near the back wall, standing quietly in coats that didn't match the room, I noticed a cluster of familiar faces. Beverly from the bank. 2 volunteers from the church pantry, who apparently Wallace had quietly reached, sensing I might need more than one ally in that room. They didn't cheer. They didn't call attention to themselves. They simply stood there, present, The way people stand for someone who once stood for them, and it meant more to me than anything spoken from that stage. Security escorted Lauren out first, her emerald gown dragging through spilled champagne, her parents slipping toward a side exit. The moment cameras turned their way, caught anyway by 3 different phones raised in the crowd. Pierce was walked out in handcuffs past a ballroom full of the exact people he had spent years trying to impress. Later, in a quiet dressing room behind the stage, Jared sat with his tie loosened and his face in his hands, weeping without any performance left in him at all. He apologized again and again for the wealth that had built a wall between us, for believing a lie for 3 years, for never once driving to my apartment himself instead of trusting a voice on the phone. I crossed the small room and pulled my son into my arms the way I hadn't in years. And he let himself be held like a boy again, and I let myself hold him without a single trace of the stoic distance I'd carried since Diane died. "There is something I need to say," I told him, once he'd steadied. "This isn't only her failure. I let my pride keep you from ever knowing how bad it got. I could have called you the day I lost the house's warmth to that broken radiator. I chose silence instead, the same silence I taught myself for 40 years at work. That silence nearly cost me my life, and it cost you 3 years of guilt you never should have had to carry." He shook his head, but I reached into my coat and pulled out the folded letter instead of arguing the point. I read it to him there, in that quiet room, Diane's plain, careful handwriting, her decade-old hope that he would surround himself with people who loved him enough to tell him the truth even when it cost them something. Jared's hands were shaking by the time I finished, and he held the letter to his chest the way you'd hold something alive. In the weeks that followed, the fallout moved with the same cold efficiency Jared brought to everything he built. As the trust's grantor, I exercised the authority that had been mine the entire time and formally removed Lauren from any role in its management, redirecting every future dollar through an account only I controlled. Her attorneys, facing an airtight forensic audit and a state bar investigation into her own lawyer, advised her to sign an acknowledgement accepting the change without contest, rather than fight a case she could not win. Pierce lost his license within the month, facing charges tied to 4 separate elderly victims whose families, once the story broke, finally understood why grandmother's modest retirement account had quietly emptied over the years. None of them had thought to question closely enough. I didn't move into Jared's penthouse when he begged me to. I bought a small brick house instead, with a working fireplace and windows that actually kept the wind where it belonged, entirely on my own terms. Jared visits every Sunday now, not out of guilt, but because he wants to. The scholarship fund still carries his mother's name, and this spring, without me asking, he quietly added a second line to it, a fellowship for families navigating elder financial abuse, named simply for the auditor who taught him everything he knows about protecting what matters. I still walk to the church pantry on Tuesday mornings, but I don't stand in line anymore. I put on a volunteer apron and hand out soup to people the world has decided to stop looking at closely, the way it once stopped looking closely at me. A few months after that gala, I went back to visit the old house one more time, the one where 6 years of quiet mortgage payments had once bought my son a future he never knew I'd financed. The same woman answered the door, recognized me, this time from the news, and smiled before I could even say a word. "I know exactly who you are," she said. I told her that made 2 of us, finally, and I meant it in a way I hadn't been able to for years. True power was never in the volume of a threat or the size of a bank account. It lives in patience, in the quiet discipline of a man who refuses to let anyone else write the ledger of his own life. Nobody who mistakes silence for weakness ever bothers to check the math until it's already too late. If this story reminded you of someone in your own family who deserves a closer look, leave it in the comments below, and never let anyone convince you that being underestimated is the same thing as being powerless.